Greg is an associate professor of psychology at Stanford University. He is a pioneer in the design and application of wise interventions, especially on interventions targeting belonging and certainty, which he'll be talking about today. His work has been published in top field and general science journals, including Nature, Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And in 2011, he was selected as a rising star in psychology. And it's fair to say this star has risen in the past decade since. And we're especially delighted to have him here at the school because much of his basic research that he's been conducting over the last decade or so has been applied in global contexts here at the school, including by Professor Anandi Mani, who will be in conversation with him at the end of the talk. So please share a hand with me in welcoming Greg Walton.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you all for being here. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be here. I especially want to thank Jamie for all the enormous work he did in making this happen and bringing us together. And I also just want to say it's inspiring. It's really inspiring to hear about all the work that people are doing here to address some of the problems and the hardest problems that we face around the world. So it's an honor to be with you. My plan today is to present the work that my colleagues and I have done around belonging and certainty and interventions to try to support a sense of belonging among students in school, in part because I think that work is important and relevant to a place like Oxford, but also because it provides a kind of model, a conceptual model, and an empirical model, a methodological model for how to think about interventions, psychologically wise interventions in many other kinds of contexts. I'd like to have both of those conversations in mind at once. So as a social psychologist, when I begin by thinking about a problem, I think about what the world looks like to the people who are involved in that problem. And so when we think about a school situation, what does school feel like if you're sitting in the third row of a classroom and you're looking forward towards a teacher and you're trying to figure out what that space is like? And one of the things that we know is that in this situation in the classroom, I think we can relate to this all at a personal level as well as at as well as an intellectual level, is that there are certain kinds of core questions that come to mind, questions that might pop into our minds at different times. We can think about these questions as different kinds of worries that students have in school. And so one kind of worry that a student may have is a worry around belonging. Is this an environment in which I'll belong, where people will value me, where people will respect me, where they will listen to my ideas, where they will help me grow and develop and become the kind of person I want to be? There's a related kind of question, which is around ability. Is this a place in which I'll be able to succeed? Can I do it? If I fail at something, does that make me dumb at that task? If I get a bad grade on an assignment, does that make me stupid? And a third kind of question is, does it even matter? If this work is frustrating, is there any point to it? Should I put my efforts towards it? And in the psychological literature, we distinguish these different questions, and we have interventions for all of these questions. And those interventions, as I'll emphasize through the talk, function by offering people answers to these questions that are often implicit, sometimes explicit. We offer people answers to them. But in the world of a student, these questions can wrap up together in a kind of toxic tornado. Can I do it? Do I belong? Does it matter? Does it matter? Do I belong? Can I do it? And that becomes a tornado of self-doubt that undermines our outcomes. Now, one thing I want to also emphasize is that these questions are very reasonable. Students have excellent reasons for asking these questions. In many, many ways, and many redundant ways, our sociocultural contexts and our institutional contexts give students these questions to ask. And so in the United States, for instance, a huge part of the sociocultural circumstance of education is a circumstance of exclusion and social class and race ethnicity-based exclusion from educational opportunities. We see that vividly in examples like this. This is an image from the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas in response to the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus Board of Education. But there are many, many other images that we could show you, that we could talk about around things like affirmative action and inclusion in higher education today. So contexts are raising these questions for students, and we can then start to articulate what those questions can be. And the question can be something as big and broad and important as this. Can people like me actually belong and succeed in school, in America, in the United Kingdom, wherever it is that I might be? That's a very significant, it's a fundamental kind of foundational question that's guiding a person as they're navigating that setting. And we see people articulate this question, including some of the most prominent, successful, admirable women of color in America today. This is Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, Puerto Rican American, and a woman who grew up in the Bronx. She writes at Princeton, where she went to college, "I felt like a visitor landing in an alien land. I've spent my years since Princeton at law school and my various professional jobs, not feeling completely a part of the worlds I inhabit." We see this in another Supreme Court justice, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, confirmed just recently to the Supreme Court. And I want to play for you a bit of an exchange, a 2-minute exchange between her and Senator Padilla, my senator from California, in her confirmation hearings. And one of the things I want you to notice is the emotion that's present, a little bit below the surface, but present both for Senator Padilla and for Judge Jackson.
I will tell them what an anonymous person said to me once. I was walking through Harvard Yard my freshman year. As I mentioned, I went to public school, and I didn't know anything about Harvard until my debate coach took me there to enter a speech competition. And I thought, this is a great university. It was basically one of the only ones I'd seen. And I said, maybe I'll apply when I'm a senior. But I get there and whoa, so different. I'm from Miami, Florida. Boston is very cold. It was rough. It was different from anything I'd known. There were lots of students there who were prep school kids like my husband, who knew all about Harvard, and that was not me. And I think the first semester I was really homesick. I was really questioning, do I belong here? Can I make it in this environment? And I was walking through the yard in the evening, and a Black woman I did not know was passing me on the sidewalk. And she looked at me, and I guess she knew how I was feeling. And she leaned over as we crossed and said, "Persevere." I would tell them to persevere.
I would tell them to persevere. So, Oxford is also a very prestigious institution, goes without saying. But what if you grew up in a neighborhood like this, say, working class place perhaps, and then you found yourself going to a place like this? What might that feel like? What might you think? What might you worry about? What kinds of cues around you might you be attending to? Now, I have the fortunate circumstance of being confident that I belong at Oxford, because I saw this earlier today as I walked into to this building, but I put this up as a joke, but also to illustrate all the different ways now we're starting to look around the world. If you're in that circumstance of what we'll call belonging uncertainty, you're looking for all these cues. They might be little cues, or they might be big cues. Have you been punting on the Thames? Do you know how to pronounce Maudlin, or do you say something like Magdalene? These are all things that are going to come up in daily life that people are going to look at and try to make sense of. And the reason why they're looking at it and making sense of it is because the context has given them a question. Maybe you're coming from a group that hasn't traditionally belonged in this space, and that space might be really important for you, really important for the kinds of goals and dreams that you have. You heard that in Judge Jackson's comments. Harvard was a place that could take her to new spaces. It could bring her to the Supreme Court of the United States. It could help her make a difference for the communities that she cares about. But would she belong there? So that question is on the table. And when that question is on the table, it changes how we make sense of our daily experience. That question informs the meanings that we draw. It informs how we read the world. If you feel excluded, maybe you are excluded from a party, for example, you didn't get invited, does that mean you don't belong? Does that mean you'll never make friends? If your professor gives you a bunch of critical feedback on an assignment, does that mean that he's biased? Does that mean that he thinks that your group isn't capable? If you get a bad grade, does that mean that you aren't capable of succeeding? Those questions become alive and active when we're in spaces where we're wondering about our belonging. And so what are people doing then? The people are trying to construct answers to the questions that they're facing. They're trying to figure out, do I belong or not in this environment? And they're doing that from the kinds of cues that are around them. This is the college portrait of Michelle Robinson Obama from Princeton. And while she was First Lady, she told an incredible story at the White House about her experience coming to Princeton. She told a group of college leaders and students, when I first arrived at school as a first-generation college student, I didn't know anyone on campus except my brother. I didn't know how to pick the right classes or find the right buildings. I didn't even bring the right size sheets for my dorm room bed. I didn't realize those beds were so long. So I was a little overwhelmed and a little isolated. Like, keep in mind here, at this point in 2014, Michelle is probably the most prominent, successful, and admired woman in America. She has been professionally successful for decades in Chicago, in philanthropy, in organizations in Chicago. The incident that she is recalling happened decades earlier. And what was that incident? It was no racist person doing something. There's no other actor in this situation. It was a hassle. It was an inconvenience. But the fact that she didn't know what kind of sheets to bring to college, she as a first-generation college student, she as an African-American person, as a person from the South Side of Chicago, as a person who is a descendant of enslaved peoples in the United States, attending a school like Princeton, where something like 8 of the first 9 presidents all owned slaves, well, that hassle, it resonated that meaning for her. So much so that she can recall it and tell it back decades later. So we call this belonging uncertainty. It's not a belief that you don't belong. It's an uncertainty. It's an up in the airness. It's an unsureness. It's a wanting to figure it outness about your belonging in a important space. One of the first studies that we did to look at this phenomenon was a very simple laboratory study. In this case, we brought in Black and white college students at a predominantly white selective institution. And we just had 2 conditions. In one case, we asked people to list 2 friends of theirs who might fit in well in a particular field of study. In this case, the field was computer science. It doesn't matter so much what the field was. This is an easy task. Everybody could do this, no problem. In the second condition, we just asked people to list 8 friends. And here the task was difficult, and it was difficult for everybody. So people would have the experience of starting to maybe list some people who maybe wouldn't fit in so well in computer science, or maybe they weren't really friends with that person. And what we were interested in as psychologists was what meaning, if any, would attend to that difficulty experienced listing those friends. And what you see here, looking at one representative outcome, is that for white students, it really didn't have much implication. So white students are kind of moderately, actually a little bit pessimistic here about their potential to succeed in computer science irregardless of condition. We had a third condition for Black students where they didn't list any friends. And here they're a little bit more positive about that potential. When they'd been asked to list 2 friends, they were even a little bit more positive. But when they've been asked to list 8 friends, they suddenly started to doubt their potential to succeed in computer science. They also started to discourage a Black peer, but not a white peer, from pursuing computer science. They started to think more on lexical tasks, to think more about race and racial stereotypes, as though what was on the table as a consequence of the difficulty of listing those 8 friends was not just that maybe I might not belong here, but maybe my group doesn't belong here as a whole. So here's a process model from many studies now. So if you think that if your belief about belonging is that the experiences that you're having are not typical, that they're somehow distinct to you or distinct to your group, it's easy to draw the interpretation from that kind of daily event. Maybe this means that people like me don't belong. Maybe this means people like me can't succeed in this space. And what do people do when they have that thought? They start to withdraw. They're less likely to go to office hours. They study less hard. They're less likely to go join a student group. And if you start doing those things, you're less likely to develop the kinds of relationships that every single person needs. Peer relationships, friendships, mentor relationships that we all need to grow and succeed in spaces like college. And then as a consequence, people are more likely to drop out and they do less well. So the question then for intervention was, can we offer people ways of understanding these experiences that prevent those global inferences of non-belonging? Can we give people ways of thinking that would prevent them from drawing the conclusion from everyday adversities, everyday challenges, that they don't belong or their group doesn't belong in general in that space? And one way to understand this intervention is through the language of fixed and growth. That is, to go from a space of thinking about belonging as a kind of fixed quality to something that's part of the process. So in the state of belonging uncertainty, you're looking out at the world and you're asking of every experience you have, do I belong or not? Does this mean I belong or not? Yes or no? Instead, we want to help people towards a process mindset, to understand belonging as a process of growth and development, that it is for everybody. It takes time, it takes effort. There will be times it doesn't feel good. There will be times that you are isolated. That's part of the process. And the question is, how are you going to develop your belonging? How are you going to find the relationships, the student groups, the mentor relationships that will be that difference for you? And what we see when we do this intervention is that then students experience the same kinds of adversities on a daily basis. It's still the case that sometimes you get excluded. It's still the case you don't get invited to a party. You might still get criticized by your professor. In fact, your professor might be nasty towards you sometimes. But it protects people's global sense of belonging, even when those bad things happen. And then people can sustain their engagement in school, build stronger relationships, and ultimately achieve at higher rates. So we deliver this intervention through stories and then through what we call saying is believing tasks. So here's a sample story. This is a white woman who is a senior at a college, and she says, I love my school. I wouldn't trade my experiences here for anything. I've met some close friends. I've had some fantastic experiences, and I've certainly learned a lot. So she is not just dissing the school, right? So she's emphasizing the school is positive in the end. Still, I think the transition to college is difficult, and it was for me. The freshman year, I didn't really know what I was doing. I made a lot of casual friends at parties, other social settings. I avoided interacting with professors in class and office hours, I think because I was intimidated by them. It got a lot better once I chose a major I was excited about. I began to make close friends through classes and labs, and I started to get involved in research with one of my professors. Now I'm happier than I've ever been. It's really rewarding for me to feel like I belong in the intellectual community here. So here there's a very much an effort to acknowledge, to surface the negative feelings, the feelings of intimidation, the feelings of being out of place, to put those out there, to see those, but then to draw paths of growth over time. So in our original trial at a highly selected, predominantly white college with Black and white undergraduates, we saw that for Black students in our control condition, there was essentially a flat line in their term-by-term GPA over time. A little dip in the middle, a little recovery, but they're not showing sustained growth in grades over time, as you might think they should, since they're taking classes with all class years. Like they're not demonstrating the growth that you would expect. But what the treatment does is it produces that linear growth over time, as though every term students are getting more resources, more support, more psychological resources, more confidence in their belonging, more relationship resources, more friendships, more study groups, more mentor relationships that are helping them sustain a path of upward trajectory. The white students are showing no difference by condition and small gains over time. Because this is really an effect on a trajectory, the gains actually get larger with time. They don't get smaller with time. So overall, over this 3-year post-intervention period, the intervention reduces the racial achievement gap by 52%, but that reduction is largest in the senior year when it's about an 80% reduction in the achievement gap. And because what it is that we're addressing is so important to all of us, so foundational as a sense of belonging, we see a bunch of additional benefits, including improved self-reported health, and well-being, greater happiness at the end of college. We also know from other data that students are going to the doctor less with the treatment. So here's an example of the process. This is a daily diary report from a participant in the study. So she is asked every day, they're asked, what happened to you today, good, bad? And she says, everyone's going out without me and they didn't consider me when making their plans. At times like this, I feel like I don't belong here and that I'm isolated. When we looked very closely at these responses, we saw that the first sentence was the kind of thing that everybody was experiencing regardless of race and condition. What the intervention did was it cut off the inference. It prevented that negative event from having that global meaning. And statistically, from a statistical mediation perspective, that actually predicts the gain in grades for African-American students. Now, if that's changing and students are starting to build relationships, will there be even further downstream effects? Former student Shannon Brady, now a professor at Wake Forest, did an enormous amount of work to track these participants to age, their current age 27, and attained an 87% retention rate for them to survey them. And she gave them a survey assessing major life outcomes like career success and satisfaction, life satisfaction and well-being, involvement in the community leadership. And she finds these striking patterns. So on a percentile measure, like the 2 versus 8 friend measure that I was showing you before, African-American adults now are reporting that their career success is about average for people of their graduating class. But in the treatment condition, they're reporting that they're well above average, 69th percentile. If you look at psychological well-being, here we'll look at life satisfaction. You also see a very large gain in life satisfaction 10 years later. This is equivalent to estimates of what it would take, what a $2.5 million lottery would produce for a person. And people are significantly more likely to be leaders in their communities, which is at the end of the day, an incredibly important outcome that we want university graduates to be able to do is to lead in their communities. How did students get there? It's not that they got better grades. The grades do not predict these outcomes robustly, and they don't mediate those results. Instead, it has to do with relationships that people are forming. In particular, it seems that mentor relationships are critical. So among African-American students, when we ask them, did you have an academic mentor in college? That doubles with the treatment. When we ask them, did this mentorship continue after college? That's far more likely with the treatment. When we look at the stories, we can really just see in like blunt detail how this happens. This is a control condition participant and an African-American participant. I wouldn't say I received any mentorship, not for lack of interested professors. I didn't really seek it. And this is a treatment condition participant. First semester was very difficult for me. I was struggling academically, didn't feel like I fit in, was unhappy with my major. Began to spend more time speaking with my freshman counselor. We bonded. She helped me to realize I did belong. Thanks to her, I was able to connect better with my peers and perform better academically. We've kept in touch ever since. These relationships are essential to success and well-being in our modern societies. And that they can be prevented by barriers like persistent worries about belonging. People cannot form those relationships even when they're available because the society is implying to them that they don't belong. Statistically, this greater mentorship mediates those gains, those long-term gains, those 10-year gains in career success and in life satisfaction. Okay, that was the original trial. We've replicated and extended this many times in many different populations. And I'm happy to talk about that, many different post-secondary contexts in the United States and in Europe and in Canada, also in secondary school contexts, middle school students. What I want to emphasize, though, in the last part of this empirical section is interventions that are done at full institutional scale and that are preparatory for students. So these are opportunities that we have to work with institutions to offer students belonging modules as they're entering into an institution, and to do so at full scale. So one conceptual question here is, can we give students helpful theories for making sense of their belonging in advance before college starts? Can we give people a kind of roadmap for meaning? And this is a really important question for application, because colleges and universities actually often have better ability to reach full classes prior to matriculation, before everybody's separated into many different majors, before people are super busy on campus. They have that opportunity. So for example, universities will typically send out survey devices that ask people to introduce themselves to their academic advisor, upload health insurance information, do whatever else, like say something about what they would like their new roommate to know about them, for example. And this is an opportunity for intervention. Because we can do this at very large scale, both within institutions and across many institutions, the thing that's going to be really important for us today is to see how that helps us learn about contextual heterogeneity. Where does an intervention like this work, and where does it not work? And what do we learn from that? So we had the opportunity originally to do this in 3 sites simultaneously in trials 9, 10, 11. There was a trial 12 was done by collaborators. And as you see here, that 9, 10, and 11 all were successful in improving core academic outcomes over the first year of college. And in site 12, or trial 12 here, it didn't produce those gains. Which is part of why we really want to understand where the intervention is going to work and where it's not going to work. Because of those successes, we also were able to create tools that are now freely available for college and university students making these transitions. But from a science perspective, what we want to understand is the contextual heterogeneity. So no longer is the question whether belonging interventions can improve student outcomes. The question is where does that happen and where does that not happen? How can we understand that systematically? To do that, we've developed a construct that we call affordances in settings, and we've distinguished 2 different kinds of affordances that I think are going to be broadly important as we think about many different intervention contexts. So one is a objective affordance. When Gibson talked about affordances in the 70s, this was a bit of what he meant. So a glass like this, it affords holding water. It has an objective quality. And so objects and physical spaces provide us opportunity structures. They define what actors can do within those settings and what they can't do. So we were able to look at objective affordances in a long-term follow-up with this trial of urban charter school students. These are students in the Philadelphia area and in the Houston area who then dispersed to many, many different and varied 2- and 4-year colleges. And what we did was we looked at their college graduation outcomes. Did the intervention in May of their senior year of high school, before they entered college, affect their likelihood of graduating from college on time in 4 years? And what you see is that kids who entered, whose first college they entered was a 2-year school or a broad access 4-year school where 4-year graduation rates are very low and not well supported institutionally, there's no positive treatment effect on graduation outcomes. But kids who entered the more select 4-year schools that do afford that opportunity to a greater extent, that's where you see a quite significant and large gain in graduation rates. In fact, if you look at those students who instead earned a 2-year degree, which is afforded more by 2-year institutions, there you see that in those 2-year institutions, the treatment is producing that outcome. So the treatment is helping students achieve the objective that the institution itself is aligned to support. A second way to understand affordances is psychological, not objective. That is, does this context permit you to really construe or believe or interpret in the way that the intervention is offering people? So the intervention is offering people this idea that worries about belonging are normal, that they can improve with time, that that's true for everybody, that that's true for you. Is that really true in a setting? Because there are settings where that is not true. So we developed an organization called the College Transition Collaborative that was built originally to start to ask this question. And there's lots and lots of people involved in this trial. This is a very complicated and multifaceted trial. So we can talk about that too. And in the work, we collaborated with 22 different colleges and universities across North America. These are very variable institutions. Some of the most selective institutions in the United States are on this list. institutions that are very broad access that admit almost everybody who applies are also on this list. There are small colleges on this list, and there are big landmark public universities. This group of colleges generalizes to about 750 four-year nonprofit degree granting institutions in the United States. That's our generalizability sample to which we're trying to understand where the intervention is more and less effective. In developing this work, we developed this construct of vulnerability and opportunity. Who is vulnerable to the worries about belonging, and who has the opportunity to belong? Because it's at that intersection we predict gains. The primary outcome we look at is, do students complete the first year full time? Do they complete? That's a primary benchmark on the way towards graduation. So the first question is, who is vulnerable? In contrast to past research, which has looked at canonical social groups like African-American students or first-generation college students or women in STEM, here we know theoretically, and we know from lots of empiricism that group identities shift with context. So we're going to define it in context. We look at students from every intersection of a race, of a first generation status, of a college, and a cohort. So students who are at your college, in your cohort, with your race, ethnicity background, with your first generation college student background. That's what we're going to call a local identity group. And we're going to understand what the circumstance is. What's the psychological circumstance of all of these 374 local identity groups? The first thing we want to ask is your local identity group performing poorly on our outcome measure as compared to other groups? So is your local identity group achieving first year full-time completion rates at low levels? That's a vulnerability to belonging for many reasons. And then the second question is your local identity group have opportunities to belong? We look at spring term survey responses from students in the control condition at each local identity group. Does that local identity group, do those students who are in your local identity group, have they achieved a moderate or high level of belonging by the end of the first year, or have they not achieved a moderate or high level of belonging? That's the opportunity measure. The details here are not so important, but there's a very complicated, rigorous, multi-step analysis process here. The bottom line is that the predicted three-way interaction in the middle here is highly significant, and I'm going to show you that next. Here, what we see in red are the minority of students who are in local identity groups that are not afforded belonging. That is that this is about 15% of the sample, and they do not achieve a high level of belonging by the end of the first year. And it's with these groups that we see no treatment effect, irregardless of their level of prior performance, those groups' prior performance. But when we look at the groups that have medium to high levels of afforded belonging, we see positive treatment effects overall, especially positive treatment effects among the groups that have been performing poorly, that are vulnerable to these questions about belonging. So the greatest effects are here, where we have groups that are vulnerable to worries about belonging. They're poorly performing historically, but they do have the opportunity to belong. The belonging intervention unlocks that potential for them. So from a theoretical perspective, then we use this metaphor that change requires planting good seeds, like offering people adaptive psychological ideas in soil that's fertile for those seeds. And I want to emphasize this word offering. So we're offering people answers to troubling questions that they face. And then it's an offer. And so people can take up those answers, or they cannot take up those answers depending on the affordances of the situation that they're in. If your college context doesn't afford opportunities to belong for your group, then people will drop that idea like a hot potato. It's not legitimate, it's not true locally, and it's not useful for you in that setting. So then the implication is that to cause change, we have to understand both how contexts afford the ways of thinking, and we have to understand those psychological processes themselves. We have to understand that intersection. What are the settings that afford people to have these more adaptive ways of thinking, and how can we offer those adaptive ways of thinking? And that implies a future generation of research, which is emerging now, on how can we intervene effectively to create better school context for people. Okay, now I want to step back from that intervention some and start to think about what are we learning from the belonging intervention, and then how do we understand what I call psychologically wise interventions. So I want to just emphasize two big things that we learn from an intervention like this. The first is theoretical things. We change our theories of a problem, and we change our theories about a psychological process, what that process is, and how it's working in vivo in people's lives. So we're learning from this intervention that concerns about belonging have causal effects on inequalities that we see in school. We learn some about how those processes are working, for whom they're working, where they're working. So that's theory about the problem, about inequality in school, theory about the process, the psychological process, how it works in the world. And the second thing is that we're learning something that's really important for application. How can we begin to remedy this inequality? It's an applied implication. In some ways, the first point here is a point about the control condition, and the second point here is a point about the treatment condition. Okay, so what are we doing when we do wise social psychological interventions? First thing to say is that wise interventions are not nudges. So you can nudge an object. We are not sort of pushing people around in their feelings of belonging. They're also not skill building per se. We're not building a particular skill that people have. And they're not also information, at least not information in a narrowly construed way. Instead, they are working at the level that social psychologists use this terrible word called construal. And so I say the first C, construal, but we'll talk about what that is. We use many, many words to talk about this kind of thing. This is like how people make sense of themselves, other people, or social situations. How do people make sense of their belonging? How do they develop that? We could use a word like construal. We could use a word like mindset or mental model or schema or narrative or interpret. There's lots of words, lay words, technical words that we use to describe this bucket of stuff. And many of these terms risk misinterpretation. And so sometimes these terms can lead people to think that in kind of victim blaming ways, like I've heard students say you should have a growth mindset, or I was told I should have a growth mindset. It can make people think, oh, it's like all in your head. Why don't you just think differently? Like the problem of inequality is all in your head, so just think differently, which is of course not accurate and not helpful. It could also make it seem like it's like fixed and hard to change, like people have a kind of well-built kind of schema or mental model, and it's kind of hard to grapple with. Instead, what I think is much more useful is to understand this in terms of the questions and answer dynamic that I introduced at the beginning of the talk. That is that people have core questions that they're trying to figure out. And so wise interventions are wise to those questions that people are asking. And these are questions about the most important things in our lives. They're questions about our identity, how we're seen, questions about our goals, whether we can achieve them, questions about belonging, how other people will receive us and value us, questions about trust, questions about relationships, like, am I loved? Am I a good parent? These questions, as I emphasized in the beginning, are absolutely reasonable. They come from context. If a first-generation college student is asking, do I belong in college? Well, her family hasn't belonged in college before because she's a first-gen student. That is coming to her from the world she faces. And that implies the direct relevance that wise interventions then have to social inequality, because often it's the adverse contexts themselves that are giving rise to the most pejorative questions. It's not the continuing generation college student who's asking that question when they come to college. The questions are dynamic. Like we're trying to figure out the answer. We don't know the answer yet. We're grappling with it. We're contending with it. We're working on it. We're worried about it. These are all actions that we're doing. We're not in a fixed state. And yet also this process can be implicit and hidden. We can suppress it. Like show me the 18-year-old who's willing to volunteer that they're worried about whether they belong in their university. We don't want to admit these questions. So we push them away, we suppress them, and then we don't deal with them in ways that will be useful for us. The third C around what wise interventions are, how they work, is that we're at risk of this calcification process, that we risk drawing inferences from our daily experiences and then behaving in ways that make our fears come true, pulling back, withdrawing, lashing out potentially, and then not building the relationships that we need. Wise psychological interventions then offer people adaptive answers to the questions they face. And people have to find those answers legitimate and authentic and useful. And people have to own them too. It's not that you just give them and then they're sort of there in their head and fixed. There has to be an active engagement. There has to be a back and forth. People have to think about how it translates to their lives. What does this look like for me? How does this apply to me? Maybe people talk about it in their communities, in their groups. They depend for their effectiveness on the objective and psychological affordances of situations, as I emphasized. And in that sense, they're the engine oil, not the engine. They are designed to make systems work more efficiently and to achieve their potential, but they don't replace the systems that we're actually in. They don't make the school itself better. So here's a way to see this in a couple of examples. This is one of my favorites from a social psychologist named Daphne Bugenthal, who was interested in social class and child abuse. Parents, single parents who had a lack of support, were isolated, often had a history of being abused themselves. She found that a core question they were asking was, am I a bad parent? And is my child a bad child? And then they would have difficulties in parenting. A child wouldn't take a bottle, and that would affirm those questions that they were asking. They would seem like answers like, yeah, you really are a bad parent, or yeah, your baby really does prefer your mother. And then that would lead parents to feel powerless. It increased mothers' depression rates, and it increased child abuse. So Daphne did this elegant, beautiful intervention. Social workers asked parents, what's the most significant challenge you have with your baby? They would answer with some pejorative reason, and they would keep asking, could it be something else? Until the parent came up with a reason that wasn't baby or self-blaming. Then they would have those difficulties, but they'd be able to work on them and make progress on them. And the outcomes are transformative for mothers' lives and for babies' lives. Here's a second example from some of our recent work on kids transitioning from school, from juvenile detention back into school in Oakland, California. So these are kids who face an intersection of social stereotypes that's incredibly powerful, that represents them as troublemakers. So if a teacher is receiving a kid who's coming back to school, they're gonna likely ask the question, is this kid gonna be a troublemaker? Is this kid gonna disrupt my class? Is he even gonna try? Does he even care? And then there's some day-to-day challenges, a difficult transition. There's some day-to-day challenges, kids behind, kid backs out, and the teacher finds their question confirmed, and they feel negative about that student, and they tend to see him as a troublemaker. The intervention that we developed, I'm not going to go into the details here, but it elevated kids' own voices in a positive self-introduction about who they are as a person, their values, their goals, to a teacher they've chosen, asking for that teacher's support. And then the teachers are ready for those challenges, but they're ready to support the kid. They're more committed to them. They're more confident that the student can succeed in the end. They feel more love, hope, trust, and respect for the student, and kids are less likely to recidivate to juvenile detention. So there are many, many different interventions that can be understood as addressing the core questions that people face. Here's just a small sample in diverse settings. And when we develop these interventions, what we should do is first begin by trying to listen for the questions that people are asking, knowing that they may be suppressed, they may be implicit. Understand the institutional and cultural context people are in, and ask, what are people trying to achieve here? Like, what really is the goal that people have in this setting? And what do people worry about that could get in the way of that goal? And then to ask ourselves, okay, understanding this setting, this culture, this institution, the goals people are trying to pursue, what better answers are possible? What's going to be legitimate and useful for people in this setting? And then you offer that to new people. You surface the questions that people are facing. You bring it into our explicit awareness, but directly for a person in the space in between people. You represent those questions as normal, and you represent them as not pejorative. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you, likely to, definitely going to have bad outcomes if you're having these questions. These questions are normal. They're coming to you from the context, and here are the opportunities that exist for improvement. And then you do small scale tests because the world is complicated. Psychology is complicated. You ask just first, can this work? And then you start to ask, okay, how does this work? And then maybe you do larger scale tests and you ask, okay, could we do this at scale? Could this work at scale? And where does it not work? Because that's going to be really important for us, understanding systematically where it does not work. Okay, thank you so much for that. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you for that very stimulating, very thoughtful presentation. A bunch of questions that came up, and I think that slide you had in the end in terms of the subtlety and the thought that goes behind developing. Sorry, I should turn this on.
You have to hit the button.
Yeah.
I guess let me start with, since we are a policy school, I am going to throw it open in a second to the others, but the first question that came to mind was, there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of detail and thoughtfulness, as you said, that has to go in, where the questions have to surface almost organically for the people involved. And putting on my economist hat for a minute, it makes me sort of ask the question about, yes, the end intervention may be light touch, but given the amount of work that has to go in and that it has to work for the individual and it might take them less or more time, how scalable, do you see these things as being?
Yeah, I think it is really important to invest in the basic research. I think that's really important. And I think the problems that we face in the world are obviously worthy of that kind of investment, from a cost benefit analysis, I don't think you even need to do that comparison.
Yeah.
But I also think that the point that the questions that people are asking are reasonable, not pathological, makes them predictable, right? And if they're predictable, then it's a matter for social sciences like social psychology and like economics, as apart from a field like clinical psychology, which is defined as not necessarily as predictable, although there's a lot of overlap and a lot of gray areas in between. So the fact that they're predictable, though, means that we can begin to think about them as a matter of policy. So every single college and university is going to have students who are first-generation students, students of color. Lots of institutions have legacies that are problematic along class and race lines. And it's very predictable that a large number of those people are going to experience acute levels of belonging and uncertainty. We live in a world that has redundant fixed mindset cues. People say, oh, you're so smart, or we have tests that allegedly identify geniuses. It's very predictable then that lots of kids, when they fail a math test or they do badly on a standardized test, are going to have the thought, I'm just done with this. It's very, very predictable. And so then it's our job as policymakers and architects of contexts to ask, what do we do? How do we construct the settings that people are in, knowing that those questions are coming up in order to help people to answers that will serve them?
Absolutely. So that sounds eminently reasonable, right? Because there is a pattern here. So in a typical project, could you give us a sense of, like you talked about the small scale, and then you go to the study, and then you think about subsequent scaling. Could you give us a sense of like the time you put into the first, just, on a, you've been doing.
Well, there isn't one, it's not cookie cutter, right? Because it's
exactly,
the settings are very, so we have a project, for example, right now, graduate student whose name is Ayodada, who's from Nigeria. He's interested in gender inequality and parents' investment in northern Nigeria in their children's education. That's a very different cultural world. It's a very different institutional world, and so understanding the psychology and understanding the opportunity structures makes that project be slower than it would be if a four-year institution in the United States called me up and said, okay, we want to deal with belonging and uncertainty, and I could say, okay, here's three things you should look at right away. So
okay.
But that doesn't make it not worth doing, right? That's the work to do.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm going to ask one other question, and I want to throw it open. So on the last slide, you talked about the justice work, and you sort of brought up this question of context, right? And I think so. Given I can think about wise interventions in some senses, meaning making. Yeah. And I guess what it's bringing up for me is two types of questions from that. One is about especially if you're targeting marginalized groups, right, which have sort of these identity issues and so on. Does it make sense to give these interventions at an individual level, which I think is what you did in the justice work? Or are there markers which will tell you that maybe it makes more sense to give this as a group level intervention?
Yeah, so my colleague and former student, Jason Akanafua, who had done a lot of the work around school discipline situations, including the lifting the bar work on juvenile detention, but also work on an intervention we call empathic discipline to prevent suspensions for kids. So in the empathic discipline work, these are both interventions targeted at teachers. Okay. The empathic discipline intervention is, in a sense, a kind of mindset intervention. That is, the object of judgment is, how do we make sense of and relate to students when they misbehave in school? Like, kids are acting out. What are you going to do with that? How are you going to think about that? What's an ideal way to contend with that situation? The juvenile justice work, the focus is on this student and this teacher. So the individual student goes through a procedure. They introduce themselves personally to the teacher of their choosing. That teacher is thinking only then about that one kid who's coming back to school. Now, in the empathic discipline work, we just published a large replication of an original trial with a much larger sample. And that larger sample allowed us to look at heterogeneity in student characteristics in response to the treatment. And one of the things that we find is that the intervention is highly effective for students who have one prior suspension. So a kid has one prior suspension. If their teacher got the empathic discipline intervention, they're less likely to get suspended over the school year. But for kids who had 2 or more prior suspension, it wasn't effective. It was as though the kind of deleterious process was already going too much. And I think at that point, you need the more individuated approach of the lifting the bar intervention. You need that child needs a space to get back in touch with the opportunity for school to be a place of support, because they've been now suspended twice. Yeah. And their teacher needs to be able to see this child as somebody who really is making an effort and trying, and that is worth their effort.
I see. And the juvenile justice would be an extreme version of getting. Got it. I'm going to throw it open. I see a lot of questions here. Let me take the first one. So the first person here has asked, this is from Pamela, and she says, thank you so much for such an enlightening presentation. My question is, how long did it take to see a change in the group that received the WISE treatment?
So in the belonging intervention, you can see attitudinal changes immediately. So students will report more positive academic attitudes, and that's true in multiple trials, immediately after the intervention, in the same session that the intervention was delivered. And then the daily diaries that were assessed in the original work that show how people are making sense of daily events, and also how they're engaging in the academic environment, like whether they're going to office hours or not. Those also showed change in the first week after the treatment. So in some cases that can happen right away. In other cases, like in the pre-matriculation version of those interventions, the intervention might be delivered in May, and students don't go to school until August or September. And so there can be long delays. And that's an example of preparing people for challenges that will later come. And then you can sometimes see changes that were not visible earlier. So it's not always the case that if you don't see something early on, the intervention didn't work. Sometimes you planted the seed that becomes useful later.
I see. I hope that answers your question, Pamela. There are so many people here. Does anybody here? I don't want to just look at the iPad. People here have questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm really, really interested because I'm very preoccupied with belonging in the high school setting. And I suppose I rarely look at it from the individual mindset perspective, which seems really stupid having listened to your whole talk, because I'm often thinking about it from a systemic perspective. And I just want to know what kind of thoughts you'd have in that regard. So I'm constantly saying the belonging issue is the school's responsibility rather than the individual. So I just wanted to know what where you stood in that regard.
Well, I do think it's the school's responsibility. But I think part of the school's responsibility is to anticipate the reasonable questions about belonging that are going to come up within their setting, and then to help people to the answers that will be served them. So it really frustrates me when Stanford leaders welcome our new freshmen by saying, welcome to Stanford. 15 of you have already won Olympic medals, 12 of you have started companies, and one person reinvented gene transcription, right? This is literally what happens. And then the freshmen, the other 1,600, say, like, what about me? Clearly I don't belong here, right? That's not a productive institutional message to send. So there are more productive messages to send. In particular, it would be productive to say, you're not here because of what you did in the past. You're here because of who you can become together in the future. And that we're going to create communities of growth and support over time. You're not giving your fundraising pitch at that point. So there's lots of places where institutions have opportunities, and if they can become visible to them, the questions that people are asking as they're receiving their communications, they can provide communications that will be more useful. I also think that there's also opportunity structures for belonging that are important. So are there residence halls? How do people live? Do people have time? Does the schedule permit people to have time to interact with each other and form relationships? Is the university creating spaces where student groups can form? Is the university creating spaces where ethnic themed student groups can form? That's really important for belonging. Is the university doing dumb things like having stained glass windows that depict slavery, which some institutions have done, or naming buildings after slave owners? That's also dumb, right? So there are these things all matter.
Did I see a hand up here? All right, I'm going to pick this question here. This is from David Gilani. Thank you for the great presentation. Could you share any insight into the sweet spot of when to time belonging interventions? Not too late so that students have already begun mentally withdrawing after facing challenges, and not too early so that students can't relate to the questions around belonging.
Yeah, so it depends. So one thing to do is to look and see when people are leaving an institute. If you're concerned about dropout, for example, when is that dropout happening? You want to be attentive to that. It's not going to be the same everywhere. Belonging interventions are sensitive to timing, but they're not as sensitive to timing as affirmation interventions. And so we've done belonging interventions, as I said, months before school began. We've also done belonging interventions at the end of the first year. Both have been effective. Yeah. I tend to think that the best time is after students have had some period of time on campus and they've had the opportunity for some struggles that they're now trying to contend with. That might be the middle of the first semester, it might be the beginning of the second semester. It might depend on the context some.
Yeah.
And that question about the optimal timing, I was answering that in terms of impact and effect size, but it interacts with questions around scalability and institutional opportunities for scale. So the pre-matriculation interventions were pre-matriculation, not because we thought that was a more impactful time, but because that was the opportunity to reach full classes.
Yes, Julia.
Two very short questions. The first one is how much of these questions you could just really tell students it's like that other students are feeling very similar. So just feeling on the same boat as everyone, how much of that just impacts how students feel. And then the second one was, I was a bit confused when you said that you don't give them skills. But when you were defining some of the problems with the teacher, could it be something else? It just sounded to me very much like problem solving skills. Like, let's think, what are the barriers? What's the thing that is like stopping you from acting in one way or the other? So a bit more on what exactly is that you're giving them that. Sure.
So on the first question, what was the first question?
Feeling of that you're.
Yeah. So psychologists call that pluralistic ignorance. Like we all think that we're all alone in our experience or feeling, but actually everybody's experiencing that same thing. That's a big part of it, right? So it's a big part of it is saying that this is just to surface it and to say it's normal, and it's not about you. It's just about the situation. So now that we can talk about it in a non-defensive way, we can look at it, we can start to use our kind of more explicit kind of thinking or more conscious thinking to contend with that. How do we want to think about that? What can we do with that? We can use it more rationally. So that's a big part of it, yeah. And in fact, one thing that we did during COVID was we created online procedures that classes that were both in person and online could use. Let me just close this. I don't know why it's beeping. So they basically, students just wrote about their own worries about belonging privately, and then those were shared with the group, but nobody knew who had written what. And then it was a group discussion about that. It's very powerful. And in certain RCT cases, we were able to show improvements in grades as a consequence. So it's very powerful to do that. Then what was the second question?
It was about skills.
Yeah. So, okay. So in the empathic discipline, so you were thinking about the empathic discipline?
Yes.
So so two things. A high level point is that skills typically have dose response relationships. Like, you're going to learn calculus. The more you go to calculus and study calculus, the better you're going to understand calculus. Psychological interventions are generally more sensitive to timing than to dosage, because they're contending with the questions that people are facing at a given point in time. And so that's a high level point that's true in general. The empathic discipline intervention, so teachers, in the empathic discipline intervention, the content that's provided to teachers is 100% not rocket science or new to them, okay? So like, people go into teaching because they wanna be a great teacher for kids, and they wanna make a difference for kids, and they wanna have strong relationships with kids. And they get derailed because there's punitive cultures sometimes in schools, like zero tolerance policies that say, if you're gonna maintain control of the classroom, sometimes you have to punish kids, you have to kick them out. And that takes them away from who they really want to be as a teacher. The empathic discipline intervention helps them get back in touch with that ideal representation of what a great teacher is, especially for a kid who's struggling and maybe acting out. And what that is, it's completely not rocket science. It's actually like, okay, kid acted out, you gave the kid detention, now it's detention. Why don't you sit down and talk with the kid about what happened? Like, and don't do that in like a top-down way. Like, ask them what was happening for you. Listen to them. Right? Like, maintain the relationship. Don't exit the relationship, even implicitly. Help them grow from within that relationship. And you make that ideal visible, and then you ask teachers, how do you do that? And they say fabulous things. Like, they'll say, I remember that one teacher in an intervention said, I remember that every child is the most loved person in the world to somebody. And I want to treat them like that, even when they've misbehaved. Hell yeah, right? Right? But that's not rocket science. It's not a skill that they're learning either. They're getting back to that place.
With that lovely thought, and that they're getting back to that place, it's not a skill, it's something that they have. We will stop there. Thank you. I hope to be able to continue this conversation over dinner. Thank you all for being part of this conversation online and as well in the room. Have a very good evening.